Today we have a hands-on workshop. It's presented by Holly Marsh, and she's going to teach us all about Bokashi composting. Holly has worked in community gardens, nonprofit community organization, and has extensive experience working towards environmental justice and food security initiatives in grassroots community level projects. So please join me in welcoming Holly Marsh. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I need permission to share screen share.
Yes, I'm just going to make you co-host. Just a moment.
Okay, so just while we're getting that pulled up, I see a lot of faces, really good participation, really good attendance. Thanks, everyone. I was going to do a poll, but I think we're going to be short on time. So I'm just going to ask everybody to use the hands up. Does anybody have familiarity with Bokashi composting already? I'm just going to switch to gallery view so I can see everyone. Just using the hands up little reaction thing. So it looks to me like this is new to pretty much everyone, if I've got that right. Okay. Oh, one person knows what they're doing. Okay. And of the one person, have you done your own system before, Data? We're going into the chat here. Okay. I'm just trying to get PowerPoint.
All right, so Dana has had a system briefly.
Okay, and I guess that, did it pose challenges for you? Because I hope that that's going to be something we'll be able to work out today. Familiar but haven't tried, okay. All right, well, let's get started then. So we're going to learn all about Bokashi composting today. And oh, the other question I had was, is anybody planning on doing this with a classroom? Are there any hands up there, Andrea or Helen?
2 hands have been raised, 3 hands. So
Okay.
we've got some teachers or others involved in the education system that try this with a classroom.
All right. Great. Okay, so this is going to be all about Bokashi composting, and just to familiarize everyone, this is a method that I have been using for a few years now in my preschool classroom, so it is very user-friendly. Anyone can do it. It is very inexpensive, and it really helps to accelerate the composting process, and it is also an alternative to the hot composting method. So next slide. So basically, this is what we're going to do, a little agenda. It's going to be very straightforward. And if I could ask everyone to kind of keep their questions to the end. If there's any technical questions, throw them in the chat, and we'll have Helen on hand to facilitate any technical things along the way. But as your questions come up, you can feel free to throw them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. Okay, so what is Bokashi composting? So basically, it is an anaerobic process in which that means like there's going to be no air involved, where your food scraps are going to be fermented and then composted after. So the decomposition happens after the fermentation process. So the Bokashi process happens in an anaerobic environment, so no air, and it's basically pickling food scraps is a good way of thinking about it. So how it works is that the Bokashi medium, which is typically a bran, is added to food scraps. Then they're placed in an anaerobic environment, so a sealed environment where we've removed as much of the air as possible. And there's 2 ways in which we can remove air from the food scraps itself. You can either crush, so like with a crusher, potato masher, or you can use a weight. Then the organic materials will ferment because the Bokashi bran is inoculated with lactobacillic bacterium. and it will just slowly start to pickle your, actually fairly quickly start to pickle your food waste. So again, there's no heat that is generated, which makes it a safe method for people who are worried about compost fires and that kind of thing. And then after the fermentation process has ended, we bury the food scraps in order to get them to start decomposing outside of the anaerobic environment, because they will need air in order to decompose. So a little bit more detail on that. So the food scraps are fermented using the bran mixture, which I have a bag of right here. It is very easy to find on the internet. This brand, My Good Green Bokashi Plus, is really cheap to find on Amazon. It's easy, it ships fairly quickly. You can try different brands. I've tried a few. I generally like this one. I find the coverage really good for the amount that you get for the price. Then the fermented compost is placed into the anaerobic environment. And today I'm going to talk about the bucket method, which is the method that a lot of people use. And we'll go through how to make a DIY system. So your system will consist of, I'm just going to stop share for a moment so we can get the picture a little bit bigger. Can you guys see me? Because I can't see myself.
No, the camera is not on for you. There we go.
Oh, you didn't see any of that. Okay, hang on. You reverse. When I'm in present mode, I can't see. So this is the My Good Green Bokashi Plus medium that you can get on Amazon. It's typically between $15 and $17 a bag. And our bucket method is going to consist of 2 buckets, 2 contractor buckets, a weight, and a lid. Have a lid to keep air and pests out, but we'll get into that in more detail in a moment. And then your bokashi is going to take 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. Can you see the screen share again?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go.
So there we go. So the fermentation happens with the addition of the bokashi bran. So as you're adding in your food scraps, you're adding the bokashi bran on the top, and the moisture from the food is going to activate the bokashi bran, and then it will mix in with the liquids from the food and begin the fermentation process. So if anybody is familiar with doing fermented foods like kimchi or sauerkraut or pickles, essentially the process is very similar, except we're going to be removing the liquid as we go from the bucket. So hence the 2 buckets. So you'll need to add the bokashi bran to each layer. And basically what you're going to do is create like a little lasagna of food scraps and bokashi bran. And you're going to use 1 to 2 tablespoons on top of each of the layers. And you're going to want to sprinkle that as you go. I see a hand up, just a moment. And the air must be removed from the bucket, because we don't want the air to activate a decomposition reaction within the bucket. I see a hand up. Can we, I think, unmute?
I think it might be a legacy hand from your questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's the basics of the fermentation process. And then the layers as we go, you're going to want to keep them fairly not very deep, because you're going to want to add as much of the bokashi bran as evenly throughout the bin as you can, to make sure that everything is decomposing well. Large materials, so things like banana peels that are very big, you're going to want to break them down, because when your items are broken down smaller, they're going to decompose when they come out of the bin faster. They're also going to ferment faster. So if you want the process to take from start to finish about 6 weeks, you're going to want to make sure that the layers are small. and that there's enough bran and that everything is small. So this is where the potato masher method comes in really handy, is to really squish everything down pretty well. It first of all gets the air out, and second of all, it helps to break apart fibrous materials. Into the bin, you can also put pretty much any organic materials from your kitchen. So you can put eggshells, you can put meat, you can put cooked food. There are a few things which I will get to at the end, which you might want to experiment with either putting in or keeping out, such as bones and tissues and paper towels. They will decompose, but they do take longer. And there are some challenges associated with some of those other materials. So when your bin is full, you're going to need to rest it for 2 weeks before starting the decomposition process. And that's to make sure that everything's got fully fermented all the way through. You can rest your bucket for up to 4 weeks as long as you're not having any mold or pest issues. And that'll just really make sure that everything is thoroughly fermented before you bury it. So after the fermentation process, it does need to go through the decomposition process, which is where all of the materials will break down. And that's where you're going to see your compost turn into soil. So you will need an environment where you do have soil available. And there are several options on how you can do that. We'll get into that in the next slide. In this picture that's here, this is a compost tower, which is very, very similar to how I mix in my food scraps for gardens at home. So at the childcare center where I work, we do it in flower pots. We have large flower pots that are about 10 gallons. And then inside is regular garden soil, or you can even use potting soil if that's how you're going to be using it in the end, although garden soil is best. And then we dump in the bokashi, the fermented mixture. We mix it in with the soil, add more soil. As you go, you're going to want to be able to turn it, so to get it some air. So the compost tower is a really good method because it does have air holes on the side. And yes, you're going to want to turn it. And sunny, warm locations really do help to speed up the decomposition process significantly. So that's something to consider as well. So further into the decomposition, again, you have some methods that you can choose about how you're going to decompose your compost. You can put it directly into the ground, although in my experience, you will encounter more animals digging it up, which is not maybe the most desirable thing for most people, but they do kind of help to turn it around, and you can always rebury it after they dig it up. You can put it into a traditional hot composter. So one like that's there on the side, a traditional garden compost. You can add it to your traditional hot composter, and just making sure again that you're turning it on a regular basis. You can put it into, if you have in your yard or in your community garden, a regular compost pile. You can definitely do that. Just again, making sure to turn and keeping in mind that you will have critters. You will likely have mice, possibly rats, definitely raccoons, snakes, and that sort of thing going through your compost pile. The good thing about that is I found that a lot of animals, once they start eating the bokashi, it must not taste great to them because they typically leave it alone after they've discovered it. They just spread it around. And then the other option, as seen in the previous slide, was with a compost tower, which is the method that I typically use. And as I mentioned too, but forgot to put on the slide, is if you're in a school environment, like a classroom or a childcare center, or in a smaller area, you can use the flower pot method. So taking the compost and moving it into a flower pot with soil, moving it again to another pot to finish decomposing. So rotating it that way. So we're going to go through now. I'm actually going to I have 2 minutes here. I'm a little ahead. And I'm just going to stop share for a moment. Does anybody have anything that they want to ask at this point up until just the basics before we get into the nitty-gritties?
We had one question actually, and that was where to buy that starter, that composting starter, other than Amazon.
I have not seen it at most hardware stores, although that's not to say that if you ask like at Canadian Tire or Home Depot or any of those bigger box stores, if you speak to maybe a department manager, that they could order it in. You can also, if you search on the internet, there's a lot of companies that do have their own smaller businesses. I have bought from one company out of, I think it was BC, that does their own. There's a company, also a Canadian company, that does with coffee grounds. If you do a Google search, you will find lots of people are getting into this. And if you are interested in making your own, which is coming up in our curricular connections for teachers, it is possible to make your own. And this system has actually been implemented in developing countries who are looking to maximize their food waste productivity, I guess, minimize their food waste and maximize productivity. It has been implemented in other countries as well. The supplies are not the easiest to find, but they are relatively cheap, and it's a long process, but it can be done. Were there any other questions?
No, but I'm curious. So this is kind of new to me, this type of composting. So how popular is this compared to like just your regular having a compost pile in the backyard type of composting?
In my experience, there's a lot of people getting into it. A friend of mine is actually the head chef at a camp for climate in BC near Gambier Island, and they have an entire system on their farm now that they've implemented. And so it is gaining traction, especially with home gardeners and community gardeners, because it's such an easy thing to do. And the process is really quick. And again, it minimizes risk of things like compost pile fire, because it doesn't involve heat up to the point of decomposition.
And
so it's gaining traction.
good. So as Anne is asking, can the compost get too hot and then end up undoing like all the good bacteria that's starting to get in there? So it like basically undo your fermentation process.
It can if you add it to a hot compost pile. So if you add it to like a traditional hot compost pile where there's a lot of, especially like brown matter, the brown matter will definitely heat up, but we're not going to necessarily be looking for the fermented process to add things to the compost. Basically, it's speeding up the decomposition when it happens by breaking all of the fibers and all of the cellulose and everything. It breaks it down. So it's really soft, actually, when you go to bury it. It's like a mush pile. And it also really helps with the smell, believe it or not, which we'll get to.
All right, and one little question before you start with the rest of your, or continue with the rest of your presentation. So if you're using non-organic foods, as we all know, food is getting more and more expensive. We can't always afford to buy only organic. Would chemicals from these pesticides that may be on the food, is that going to remain in your compost?
Yes.
There you have it.
You can't undo that. not in any way that I'm familiar with for home gardeners. So that is something to consider. If you do want strictly organic compost, you are going to want to put in only organic materials, because you can't undo that.
All right, we will get to the other questions at the end, because we might be a little tight on time. So we're just going to let Holly continue, and then we'll ask the remaining questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, so let's build a system. So basically I use the bucket method, and we have several sets of buckets on the go at once. Because I work in a childcare center, so unfortunately there is a lot of food waste. Picky eaters and such. So we're going to start with 2 regular contractor buckets. Again, if you're concerned about chemical leaching, you can buy the food safe contractor buckets. I use them for pickling. They typically only come that I've seen at the Home Depot in the 5-gallon size. I use the 2-gallon size for ease of everything, because it's much easier. So you're going to have one bucket. It's going to be your holding bucket. This is going to be the one where the food scraps are going to go in, and one is going to be your drain bucket. And then we're using just a regular hand drill. I typically use roughly about a 3/16 drill bit. You're going to drill holes all around the bottom side of the holding bucket, and you're going to want to make quite a few. And so it's going to look a little bit like that. So you're going to want to have quite a few holes. You can make them smaller, but I wouldn't make them much larger than this. Let me see if I can get in a little bit closer. Because you want to keep the food in, but let the water drain out. So you can put more holes, make them smaller, but again, I wouldn't make them any larger. Now, to keep the food from going through the holes when you're putting them in the bucket, you're going to need to line the bottom with something. A lot of the things you'll find on the internet will say to use an old scrap of fabric, which is fine. A t-shirt or anything would work. Typically, though, we just use regular white kitchen paper towel, specifying that it's the regular white kind, and just layer one piece, should have opened the roll before I started, one piece of the paper towel across the bottom. And basically, the paper towel is going to decompose with your mixture. The sort of, the part that a lot of people, and we found with the children that they don't like about using the fabric method, and we have even tried using coconut coir and using jute mat at the bottom. They retain too much moisture, first of all, and then you'll end up with a separate problem. But also you have to dig it out at the end and wash it or throw it out. This will just decompose. So this guy goes in the bottom like so, just to cover the holes up like that. So you're going to want to cover all your holes just like so. So this guy fits in the bottom. He's covering all the holes. It's going to keep all the organic material in, but let the water and liquids drain out the bottom. So after you've got the bucket drilled, you've got your paper towel in, you're going to put a heaping handful, sorry, of the Bokashi brand into the bucket. So you're going to take your Bokashi brand, you're going to take a sizable handful to start because everything's going to filter through this bottom. And you're just going to put it around the bottom of the bucket. And I'm going to try and show you like so it doesn't all fall out. And then you're going to start adding your organic materials. So I typically like to start at the bottom with something that's a little bit going to soak up all of the other things. If you go and put something liquidy straight in the bottom to start, it's going to be a little bit more problematic. So if you have banana peels, fruit peels, bread, any of those into the bottom first, and then you can start adding your other foods like your cooked foods and whatever as you have them. Onions are a great one, onion skins and everything at the bottom, just to give you a little bit of a barrier. And then as you go, you're going to add the food scraps about 1 to 2 inches thick. And again, things like watermelon peels, if you're like cutting the rind off a watermelon, don't throw it in whole. Take a few minutes and either cut it down or break it into smaller pieces. The smaller pieces are going to decompose way faster, and it's going to be a much more even process in the fermentation. So after you've added your layer, another sprinkle, and it's 1 to 2 tablespoons after that for each layer. So just like a small handful, sprinkle, you can get a little shaker, you can shake it on top. You're just going to want to make sure that it's fairly even. And then you're going to put your weight on. And we've learned this the hard way, is when you're putting your weight on, I'll talk about the weight in a moment, you're going to want to put a barrier layer between the weight and the food. Plastic wrap works really well, but is a little counterintuitive to the entire environmentalism thing. So we've taken to just using another paper towel just to keep our little weight a little bit cleaner and easier to handle as we're getting in and out of there multiple times a day. Just gives us a little bit of a little layer there. And then you can remove the paper towel, you can squish it down to compost it, or you can toss it into your hot compost or whatever at that point. The weight itself, rocks, we were using rocks at one point, regular rocks from the garden, but we're finding that they, first of all, tip to one side when you put your barrier layer. So a lot of people will use like a plastic plate, like you would when you're making pickles, and just weighting it down that way. the plate gets really gross, the rock tips to one side, then you have one side pushed down and one side not pushed down. So we started buying sand mix concrete and just using a pie tin, pouring the sand mix concrete into the pie tins and making several weights. And the good benefit of that is, especially if you have multiple buckets, it's cheap, first of all. Second of all, you can, if you ever decide, I'm tired of this composting, you can make them into little walkway stones for your garden. And also you can put multiple weights. So as your bucket is getting fuller, you can take out some of the weights. And if you need more weights, because you've put in a bunch of, I don't know, watermelon peels, orange peels, something that takes up room, but needs more to squish down, you can just stack them and then remove them as needed. So then that goes on top of your compost. Oh, and you can also, if you can also make them to your bucket size too, which is nice, which helps with the air issue. You put your weight in, you're going to put your lid on, and this guy goes into your holding bucket where it's going to drain into the bottom bucket. So they'll sit flush with each other. There's about 1.5 inches of space between. So you are going to need to remove your water or your liquid as you go. The liquid can be diluted at the rate of about 1 tablespoon per, a little bit less, 1.5 teaspoons to 4 liters of water. So like a big watering can, I would use about 1 teaspoon and dilute it pretty good, and it can go straight into your garden soil. And again, you're going to want to make sure the lid is on and your buckets are nested as they're fermenting. All right. Any questions about the process so far, the demo?
We do have one. If anybody has any other, there is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a desktop computer, you can just enter there if you weren't too sure. Somebody did ask, so do you have to buy the brand? Because we all know that there are plants that might be able to speed up this process. So is there anything that we could use that we might find in nature that we could get for free?
No, because you do need that lactobacillic culture that is, it is inoculated in the bran. That's going to give you the fermentation that you want. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with something that is not properly pickled because we're removing the water. So in a typical pickling process, for example, you're using the natural organisms on the outside of the food or on the inside of the food. So like, for example, with pickles, the cucumbers, you're using the enzymes from the cucumbers, but they're also immersed in a water solution, a brine solution, correct? So we are removing the water. So you do need something to activate that process because you will be losing some of that liquid.
And if you don't dilute the liquid, is that going to have?
You will burn your plants.
Yeah, okay. A little too hot, as we say.
They don't like it. They want it to be fairly diluted, like actually really diluted. They like it best. You will get, you'll get like typical, like the singed looking on the leaves, and you might end up with mold problems in your garden.
Right. All right. So make sure you dilute the liquid. Does the lid need to be tightly sealed?
These ones on these contractor buckets, yes, they snap on tight. So it's really good for that. They snap on like this, and then you peel them open. So the buckets, these are the 2-gallon buckets, which I highly recommend that you don't go with the 5-gallon bucket, which we'll talk about after, is to go with the 2-gallon bucket because a bucket full of compressed food scraps is very heavy. It does get very, very heavy. So no more than a 2-gallon. And yeah, you do want it tight, and that's going to prevent pest problems. Okay, so I'm going to go back to share screen here.
All right.
That's not share screen.
We have a few questions if you're able to handle them now, or do you want them a little bit later?
Let me just do a time check here. Yeah, let's take them now.
Okay. Where was I? We did have a couple. Right. So do you need to, can you add as you keep eating food and have food waste, or do you need to have everything in place all at once so that you can create your layers?
No, ideally you do want to be layering it as you go and you want to add it, but I wouldn't perhaps let it sit for more than 3 weeks, adding to. I would start another bucket at that point. So if you've got about 3 weeks of scraps and it's halfway full or something, especially as you've been compressing it down, and just let it be there and then start another bucket. So the buckets, the 2-gallon buckets are, right now they're $3, $2.97 at Home Depot. And I typically find that they have really good supply with those, although I did go on the weekend to get another set as a giveaway for here, and they were short. They had lots of 5 gallons, but not a lot of 2 gallons. Must be a supply chain issue. And the lids are an additional $1.97. So it's very cost effective to make multiple buckets. And we typically have about, at the childcare center, we have typically about 5 on the go at a time.
And somebody's asking, do you have a good tip to separate the buckets when emptying the bottom? Because they, as you know, they get a little bit stuck.
They might get a little stuck, is to just take the top handle and just pull and twist, because there's air holes in this bucket, in the top bucket. Once you can break the suction vacuum, they come apart easily. So just give it a little twist and they should pull apart once you break the vacuum seal. Okay. So let's move into practical considerations, because we will have some time. So as I mentioned, choose your bucket size wisely. A 5-gallon bucket is really heavy when it is full. It is very, very heavy. It is very difficult to maneuver around. You also might encounter, especially if you're trying to fill a 5-gallon bucket, that it's been sitting around for too long, and you might end up with some undesirable consequences, like green mold and stuff. Choosing a proper home for your bin is important. If you're going, you can absolutely keep the bin indoors while you're filling it. And even after. A garage is a great idea if you have a garage. If you are going to keep it outside, just make sure it's in a spot where you don't want to have it necessarily in the sun while it's fermenting. Because you don't want it to get really hot and kill those bacteria that are doing all the hard work for you. So you do want to have it in a cool spot. Under the sink is great if you have an under the sink in your place. And then tailoring your collections to your capacity. So we learned this pretty quickly on in a childcare center, is we have a lot of food scraps and food waste. So we had to cut back on things that we were composting, and just because of our capacity. So we were rotating the 5 buckets out, and then we started running out of places to put them to finish composting. So we had to say, like, we were going to do this meal or that meal as well. There are some things that don't decompose as well. Bones is one that they definitely do decompose, especially if you can break them down with like a kitchen mallet or something in between. But we found here that bones were a particular challenge. They didn't decompose at the same rate as everything else, and they were attracting things that wanted to dig them up. And they were also a magnet for maggots and maggot larvae. So those we started avoiding those. Brown paper towels do not decompose very well, although white paper towel and tissue will decompose just fine, like the thinner kind. Fruit stickers, take the stickers off your fruit, or when you get your finished compost, it will have bits of sticker in it, and it's not very appealing, and it's also incredibly not great for the environment to have little bits of plastic in the soil. If you have a lot of meats and cooked foods, you will also likely encounter pests like maggots and whatever in the bins. They will try and go, especially if you're keeping your bin to ferment outside, you'll end up noticing that there'll be little collections of eggs and larvae around the outside if you have heavy on the meat. So make sure you have a good balance between your fruit and vegetable and your meat ratio. Breads decompose very well. Don't put in, if possible, liquids. Try and drain off any liquids. So if you have, I don't know, a soup that maybe you added way too much salt or something and you decided you're going to compost it, just make sure to drain the liquid off before putting in the solids. So as much as possible, avoid putting in too much liquids, because it'll just turn into a mushy mess. It won't necessarily all drain through as quickly as you would like it because it'll soak into the bran. The bran will be heavier on the liquid side than it should be. And again, pest control, outside, just make sure the bucket is sealed. Typically with the lids on, they're quite tight. So if you just choose to use the bucket method, animals won't be able to peel them open. It does take like a full hand motion to peel them open. And they also, because of the suction, won't necessarily be able to tip over your buckets well. And if they do, they're just going to get liquid. That's what we've found. They'll just get liquid, and that's not going to be very appealing to them. During decomposition, again, if you can use a tower or a hot composter, that works really well. If you're going to bury it directly in garden soil, you can cover it with a plank in between when you're rotating it. You will need to rotate it more often though. Or you can use this wonderful thing that they sell at the Home Depot if you're not against using plastics in your garden. It's called bird defense netting. And here at the Child Care Center, we have our flower pots that we are composting in, doing our decomposition. And we cover just all of them and put rocks around with the bird defense netting, and we just kind of bunch it up. It's like a plasticky lace sort of contraption. And it's really good at keeping the critters out, especially the small ones, because they get their feet tangled and they don't like it. So those are some methods that you can use for pest control. And again, turning it over will help it to decompose quickly, and it will aerate the smell, and it will just be much more pleasant. All right, troubleshooting. This is a good one. Okay, if it smells bad, if your compost bin smells bad, you're not doing it wrong. You're not doing it properly. It's not working properly. It should smell kind of like cider or pickle brine. If it smells really foul, like rotten eggs or any sort of rotting smell, it is out of balance, and essentially it's not fermenting, it's rotting. And we don't want it to be rotting, we want it to be fermenting. If you're getting that smell, your best bet is to toss the contents of that bin. You can, if you get it right away, you can still throw it into the hot compost and it'll do its thing in there. Otherwise, you're going to want to toss it and start again. And the reason this is probably happening is there's either too much air getting in, or there's too much air in the bucket. Your weights are not heavy enough, or you haven't pressed it down enough. You haven't masticated the ingredients enough, or you're not using enough of the Bokashi brand. If you get puddling in the holding buckets, which is my holding bucket is here. If you notice that you've got your weights on, you go to lift them up and there's little water like on the surface, what that's telling you is that your drain holes are plugged. So you can go through the bottom. Sometimes you'll get mold develop on the underside of the holes. Just try and clear out the holes of the bucket. Give it a wipe with a damp towel with no soap or anything on it. Just try and unplug the holes and see if that helps. Give it a good press to try and push whatever is blocking the holes through. And if the puddling doesn't resolve itself, again, toss it, start again. If you have maggots and larvae in the drain bucket, again, we've talked about that. You probably have too much bone or meat, or there's air or pests getting in somehow. So just wipe. They'll often collect on the outside of the bucket if you've been good at keeping it closed. Just wipe down all the larvae off the outside of the bucket again. They'll be like little egg-shaped things. Just wipe them down. You can also cover your bucket. If it's becoming a real problem, you can use plastic wrap or something over the top, even like a old sheet, and just bungee cord or elastic it so that you're trying to keep them out. Mold is okay, but you do not want blue or green mold. Blue or green mold is not a good sign. Any mold that you have in the bucket, and there will be some, should be white. We want white mold. Blue-green mold is a sign of that something's wrong. There's decomposition happening that shouldn't be happening. And one of the best ways to avoid that is, again, making sure that it's an anaerobic environment, no air going in, And also don't put in anything that's already started to decompose. So if you have an old strawberry on your counter or whatever, and it's starting to go bad already, don't toss it in. Put it in your hot compost, because it's just going to spread the spores that are already starting to develop on it, and then you're going to get the blue-green mold problem. All right, and I know we have some teachers in the room, and we're running low on time here. So there are some ways you can put this into your classroom. So especially with the younger children, I've got children in my class that are 3 years old, and they use the drill and they like to drill the holes and put the whole thing together. They get a real sense of community from doing this process together and knowing that they get to see whatever is being composted, going through the whole cycle, and then planting our milkweeds and seeing the butterflies come. So the whole construction of the bin system is really good. There, you can also do research, especially if you have older school age children, about different ways you can do it. You can often the commercial systems you can buy, which are quite expensive on the internet, involve a spigot and being able to drain the water straight from the bottom of the bucket. So there's different ways you could do STEM curriculum around that. There's the science of the Bokashi composting, which is a really great biology connection, is how does this all work? What do those cultures do? And all of that. Creating your own Bokashi medium for older grades using chemistry. And this is in that image is a little system. People will buy the cultures. They can often buy either wheat husk or something is often a byproduct, coffee grounds. There are people been using shredded paper as well, and then inoculating it with molasses and all of that. If you just do a quick Google search, you will find that there's a lot of resources on it. It just, again, does take some time. So some community connections you can make is partnering with your local community gardens or garden clubs, especially if you need a decomposition site, is being able to, can we add our compost to your compost pile? Doing coins for compost to be able to buy enough buckets to have the system. So collecting coins for compost, buying the Bokashi medium on an ongoing basis. So having that collection would be a good thing. There's also engaging in reciprocity with the land. Indigenous cultures, if you just search it on the internet, there are a lot of communities. One as close as I think Whitefish Lake is doing this. Are really embracing this method of everything gets used. It's a gift back to the earth, especially as we think about the ways in which colonial industrial agriculture methods have really taken a toll on our environment. This is a really low cost, high impact way to engage in reconciliation with the land. And it can add into a larger zero waste initiative if you have an eco club or any of that at school. This is a great way to measure your zero waste. So if you're doing waste studies at your school with eco clubs or whatever, comparing your waste before with your waste after would be a great one. And now we're almost right on time. Q&A time. So I'm going to stop share. And I am free to take any more questions.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was very informative, and I really enjoyed that presentation, as I'm sure many people who are here today have as well. Just to let everybody know, this session has been recorded, and we will be putting it on the Halton Garden Week website. If you happen to come in a little bit late, or if you have a teacher friend that you want to share this with. So just to let you know, it will be available on our website, so you can direct their attention over there. All right, we're getting a lot of thank yous, a lot of, that was a great presentation. If anybody has any questions, just enter it in the chat.
I see something in the chat about vermicompost.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, earthworms are not native, which is interesting. But also, this is a great way of turning a lot of volume over very quickly. So if you're doing multiple buckets, you're going to get quite a lot of really healthy garden soil in a really short amount of time. We're talking like within a season, you'll have restored quite a lot of your garden space. And one of the guerrilla gardening projects that I have been working on is in an abandoned playground. So the entire composition of the soil underneath where the play equipment used to be is clay and sand. And we tried so many things to bulk up the soil. We were adding compost, adding hay and straw, planting mint to break up the ground and work down the sand. And since we started adding the bokashi, our yield has gotten so much higher because, you know, you're adding direct organic compost straight in, and it's so quick, and you're going to get yield like immediately. It's really my favorite method now. And I just wanted to spread the love of how quick and easy this is, and user friendly. Children can do it. So.
All right, we're starting to get some questions now. Does the decomposition phase require the same level of heat as traditional hot compost?
No, it does not, because your material is already going to be fermented. It's going to be broken down. A lot of the fibrous materials, cellulose, etc., is going to be already really squishy. Once you start to mix it in with the soil, it's the microorganisms in the soil and the air that are going to do the rest of the work for you. So just making sure, if you're going to bury it in your garden, for example, digging a trench, you want it fairly deep, spreading your compost thinly as opposed to in a clump, spreading it out thinly in a row, cover it up. Within 2 weeks, I usually give it 3. You can turn it for a final time, and it is usable within weeks. So that's a really great thing. And no, it doesn't need heat. Heat does help speed up the process. If it's in the shade, it's going to take probably 4 to 5 weeks to fully decompose, especially if it's in clumps. But if you've got it spread nicely, it should go really fast. And what did we make the, it's sand mix cement. It's cement, sand mix. My coworker gets it for us. So if we start now, it will take approximately 2 months. This is actually a really great time to start, especially if you're using multiple buckets. You can put so if you're, for example, starting buckets now, and then you put them outside until spring, until the garden soil is workable, you can just leave them covered outside in a cold spot in the shade, and they will just sit there. We have some buckets outside here. They've been frozen all winter. Once it's spring, they'll go into the ground, and then they'll start their decomposition because they're in an anaerobic environment. They've got their lids on. There's nothing happening. It's just sitting there fermenting further.
And just some clarification about burying it in the ground. Do you put the soil over top or no?
Yes, you absolutely need soil. So you're going to want to loosen your soil. If you're going to dig a trench, loosen some soil so you can mix it in, because you're going to want all of those microorganisms mixed in. And then you're going to want to cover it with additional soil. Leaf cover on top of that is excellent as well. And then just, let it sit.
And is there a maximum depth that you should be planting it at?
Maximum, not really. Minimum, you want it to be less detectable to critters. So at least 1/2 foot, 6 inches.
So probably another reason you don't want the big giant gallon one, the 5 gallons, because you'll be digging quite the hole.
Yeah, I've done this, and they used to sell cat litter in like those little max scoop buckets. And I don't think they've now switched to cardboard, which is great. But they had the big cat litters, and I was using those at first, and they were just way too heavy. It was a pain to move around. Because once it's squished down, it's very, very heavy. So 2 gallons is, in my opinion, an ideal size, unless you're very, very strong and have a really good back.
Right. Well, that was excellent. That was an excellent presentation. I think everybody's learned something here. I'm just curious as to who's going to start this on their own at home. Oh, wait, we have a question before we go, though. Can we inoculate coffee grounds with rice water, milk, and sugar? So yeah, all those other additives like the sugar and.
Yeah, rice, coffee grounds is a common one that people, if you look it up on the internet, are doing. I haven't tried to make it myself just because the ingredients are not that easy. As for the milk, I don't believe that it has enough of the right cultures, but I think that there's a lot of people who've been trying things from what I've read. I did read up on it extensively at one point and just decided that I was going to purchase it because it is quite the process.
Yeah, I'm wondering if yogurt would work. That's high in lactobacillus, but I don't know if you've come across that in your reading, if that's
I don't recall, but yeah, you can buy the enzymes. There are proper enzymes that you can get your hands on.
Yeah, they're just probiotics. Yeah, so you might have to do a little bit of searching just to see what else you can use instead of the brand, if that's not a possibility for you. Or reach out to us and we'll reach out to Holly and we'll see if we can come up with something. Oh, yeah, another one like it's the water kefir. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah, different is the moisture. And I know that the inoculants that they sell have the water is all removed and anything that could affect the decomposition. So.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, again, this will be posted on our website, so you can view it later if you did come in late or if you had other questions.
And I do have a giveaway. I'm going to be donating to, if there's any teachers out here that would like to give a system a try in their classroom, I'm going to give away one set of the bucket with a starter supply of the brand. So if you are a teacher in the GTHA, somewhere that I can get to in my vehicle, please drop your name in the chat and we'll draw somebody out of the hat and I will come and drop off a system to you with your, make sure you leave your email address.
Yep, so just drop your name in the chat and we'll do a draw, but we've got another question in the meantime while you're doing that. And it's, I wonder if we could pickle the scraps in their juices with water kefir. Oh, that's the question. So if you could start to the fermentation process pre-putting it in the bucket, I think. Oh, and then keep growing our water kefir, so more sustainable.
I haven't tried it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the 2 liter bucket.
Trial and error. You might end up with too much moisture. I'm just from experience now, is you're going to end up with possibly some problems with mold.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it leaking through and all the rest of it.
Because you do want it to be anaerobic, and there's quite a bit of oxygen in water and liquid.
All right. All right. Okay, so how about you can always send an email to info@haltonenvironment.ca. Let's have that right. Andrew will put that in the chat. So email us if you would like to, the first person to email us will win the Bokashi composting system. info@haltonenvironment.ca. Maybe people are too frightened. It's like when you offer cookies, nobody wants to be the first one. So I think this is the case. Nobody wants to say me, it's me, it's mine. So please email us the first email we get at info@haltonenvironment.ca. They will be awarded the prize. As long as you live in the greater Toronto area and maybe Hamilton, we'll see.
Yeah.
There are some people I know you might be a little out of range, so we'll, unfortunate, but we'll try and keep it local. All right, so thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciated that talk, and everybody else, make sure you come back at 2 p.m. for Creation Care with Donna Lang.
Thanks, everyone. Again, good luck. If you have any troubles, they know how to reach me. Bye now.
All right, thanks very much, everybody.